Happy Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, June the 16th, 2021. Today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 53, 1 Samuel 15, 24 through 31, and then Luke 6, 43 through 45. Those are the semi-continuous, so that's the strain of text, daily texts from here on till we hit Advent, that if you follow them, you kind of follow this story, partly continuous story, because it's not perfectly continuous, but throughout the Bible, especially the Old Testament. And then the complementary text, like I talked about yesterday, which complements Sunday's passages, are Psalm 52, Jeremiah 22, 1 through 9, and then Luke 6, 43 through 45 again. So like the complementary and the continuous share the gospel together, or the last reading. The New Testament reading, I should say. Excuse me, there's pollen in the air and it's bothering me today. Anyway, but I'm going to look at 1 Samuel 15, 24 through 31 and talk about optics and just, how things look and how they should look, the way they're supposed to look. And because in this story, what is happening is, like, right before this, if you read the passage from 1 Samuel yesterday, Saul, the king of Israel, right, the one who God told Samuel to anoint, because like the Israelites were all about, oh, we need a king so we can just be like just all the other nations around us. Saul, let's just say he was a problem child, but God kind of warned the people of Israel that if you have a king, this is what it's going to be like. But Saul messes up royally. I won't go into the details because you can go back and look at that, but he's just kind of very self-serving and a self-centered kind of guy. And God's called him on it. Samuel, the prophet, judge, priest of Israel, has called him on it, and has told him, like, you're done. You're done. I've rejected you as king over Israel. I've rejected your household as holding the throne over Israel. Because remember, God in this kind of theocratic world of the Bible, he's the one who calls the shots. He's the one who really gets to assign kings, anoints them, right? And he tells Saul, it's over, it's done. I am done with you. I regret ever having made you king over Israel, which is interesting to think that God can have regrets like that. Anyway, so we get to this passage, and Saul is begging Samuel to pardon him for his sins. He begs him to then also return home with him after this big battle he's fought, which he was successful in, although he didn't obey God. Return home with him to offer a public display of worship to God, because it was all about optics, right? This is my way of understanding it, is it's kind of a power play, right? He knows, like, okay, well, if I don't return home and I don't have this really important leader of Israel with me to lead the people in this public worship to offer, thanks to God, it's going to raise questions, and it's not going to look good. I'm already polling low, so this is just not going to help my status, and my goodness, if the news networks get a hold of this, it's just going to be horrible. It was all about the optics for him. Saul wants Samuel, the prophet, judge, priest of Israel, with him to lend credibility to his power and his authority and his place as king over Israel. And so he says to him, he says, pardon my sin and return with me so that I may worship the Lord. Because that's, in Samuel's defense in all this, that's his role. That's his job. That's how he shows his obedience to God, is by facilitating worship for the people of Israel. That was like what he was supposed to be doing. So he says, pardon my sin and return with me so that I may worship the Lord. And like I said, I think that for Saul, it was about maintaining the image at this point. It was just about, okay, fine, I'm not king, but I'm, my throne will end, but I'm going to keep up appearances. Samuel's response is, why would I do that? Why would I return with you? Why would I go and help? God has rejected you as king over Israel because of your willful disobedience, right? Also known as your sin. So why would I lend credence to a king that isn't king? And he goes into great detail again. In case Saul didn't get it the first time, he explains it to him pretty bluntly. You have been rejected. You are a reject as king. It's over. It's done. Why would I return with you? And Samuel goes to leave, and as he leaves, Saul attempts to physically restrain him, right? It says he grabs him by the hem of his garment, right? Now, and it makes me think of that passage in the Gospels, right? Where the woman who had the issue of blood reaches out and just touches the hem of Jesus' garment, looking for grace and mercy. That's not what Saul's doing. Saul is trying to physically restrain this man of God and force him into lending credence to this rusted crown that he wears. So he grabs him by the hem of his garment, and as Samuel tries to pull away, the garment tears, the robe tears, and Samuel takes a moment to point out the coincidence or the irony, however you want to look at it, of what has just happened. He goes, fine, you just tore my robe, you just ripped my robe, in the same way that the kingdom has been torn away from you and from your household. There is no chance of getting this back, he says to him. He explains to him once again. He's like, you need to understand something. God is not going to change his mind on it. Which is interesting, because earlier we get God saying, I regret ever having made you king, so now I'm going to cut you off. And Samuel says, who is the God of Israel? Who is the glory of Israel that he will change his mind, right? So in God's eyes, you're done. I think kind of he's telling Samuel, he's like, you can pull and tug all you want, but you're not gonna turn God around on this. This is where it gets interesting for me. Not that the whole thing wasn't interesting, but he says, even after being confronted with this truth, Saul is still concerned with the optics of the situation and with keeping up appearances. He's like, yeah, fine, sure, okay, I'm a sinner. He says, but honor me now. In other words, make me look good before the leaders and the people of Israel. Because your presence lends me credibility, and this is where you kind of get this, maybe he's being more truthful than he ever has been before, or that he ever will from this point on, but he's basically saying, you know what, your presence lends me credibility. This whole act of offering worship to God is just a political act as far as I'm concerned. And that's interesting because it seems like the politicians always like to keep a few clergy around, to make their thorns look more like figs. That's a discussion for a whole nother day. But he says, so yeah, fine, I'm a sinner. Yeah, I'm horrible. I'm not king anymore. Yeah, you and I know that. But, come home, make the show, make me look good. And this is interesting thing that he says. He says, so come with me now, and so I can worship the Lord your God. That's interesting. Think about that. Why wouldn't earlier, and he's like, so come home with me so I can worship the Lord. Now he says, come home with me so I can worship the Lord your God. Why not? Why didn't he say, so I can worship my God, the Lord my God? Or why didn't he say, so I can worship the Lord our God? It's interesting because, God has indeed rejected Saul as being king over Israel, but it would seem that Saul quite possibly had rejected God a long time ago, turned his back on God and rejected him, just as the people of Israel had done, as God explains to Samuel, generations before. So Saul has just already rejected God, and which goes to show that anything that he was doing that seemed to be a pious act, seemed to be an act of devotion, was really just for the optics of it all, to make him look good in the eyes of Israel so he could maintain his power and his authority. He doesn't say my God, he doesn't say our God, but your God. Saul worships God as show, but not as devotion. He worships God out of expedience because it looks good and it works. But he's not interested in God himself. It's an interesting thing about people in power and people who are just concerned with maintaining their power, isn't it? Anyway, that's the DBR for today. We'll be back tomorrow with another DBR. Get out, enjoy the great weather. It's really cooled off a lot here in Chattanooga. It's glorious outside. So get out and enjoy the day. We'll talk to you later. Boop.